Yeah, welcome everyone. Probably some of you have had a long day if you've been throughout the day on the session, so I appreciate you sticking with us. So I'm Sam Mackenzie. I'm a Cybersecurity Committee member for the Australian Computer Society, locally known as ACS. And yeah, really excited to have Muzamil and Rashid and Michael Murphy with me as well today. And we're going to be discussing, and I'll let those gents introduce themselves shortly, but it's all about operational technology today in manufacturing. We're focused on the Australian market in this session, and from what we're hearing from the clients and the people that we're speaking to in the industry is that many of our manufacturing organisations in Australia remain unprepared, and so that's a bit about what we're going to touch on in this session. It's why we have these sessions, to raise that awareness, to help people fighting the good fight, to get the funding that they need to make the difference, to secure the organisations and supply chain for manufacturing. So, without further ado, I'll let Muzamil introduce himself a bit more, and then Michael after that.
Hi everyone, my name is Muzamil Rashid. I'm head of cybersecurity at Mazda Australia. My role is to make sure steer Mazda out of the cyber potholes, and because no one wants to, have flat firewalls, if not flat tires. Before this, I was working in a large public sector bank in India, where I was leading all the governance activities. So if you see any framework, any acronyms in cybersecurity, I'll have got my hands dirty with it. And it's a pleasure to be here and excited to share our thoughts going forward. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Muzamil. Michael, would you share a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. Michael Murphy. I am fortunate to lead the OT APAC business for Fortinet. I think this is a timely conversation when we look at some of the statistics. We know that ransomware, or the number one targeted sector for ransomware at this point in time, is manufacturing. And I'm sure that many of us would certainly feel the pain if we were exposed to adverse impacts or ramifications. So really keen to unpack this today with both of you and get some great questions from the audience.
Excellent. Thank you both. Yeah, and great to be here. I guess a couple of key takeaways that we're proposing you look out for during the conversation is around Australia's regulatory climate and how it's unique. Our challenges that we have with workforce gaps, although that some of that and the regulatory climate probably similar in other regions, but we're going to highlight some particular areas of interest in Australia. And executive buy-in, which obviously is also a challenge in other areas, but how there's some different views and attributes to it in the Australian region. So kicking off, I think we're going to hear a little bit of a case study from Michael, just to talk us through a real-world cyber incident, obviously without too many details, as a lot of these things are. So if you're able to go ahead with that, Michael, I'm sure our participants would love to hear.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. So there are a couple of things that I thought might be worth highlighting within this conversation. One is certainly some of the gaps that we've assessed and observed that are technological problems. And then the other component, which I think has historically been neglected, is really around the human and behavioral aspects. We know there are external threat actors. We also know there are internal threat actors. I think one of the observations that we've seen more frequently, especially within the manufacturing sector, is where automation industry 4.0 is really leading the charge to mitigate a lot of the requirements for humans and operational workers to be present in maybe some hostile and remote locations. Now, in preference for automation, because it drives not only innovation in some areas, but more importantly, cost efficiencies and competitive advantage, we've seen that individuals that have worked for organizations on the plant floor, maybe for decades, are incredibly loyal. But what can happen is we can see that their roles are replaced by automation. And unfortunately, and understandably, many people become, unfortunately, put in a situation where they can become disgruntled. And when they're made redundant or they're let go, they can share some information in a public forum. Maybe it's something like Facebook, and inadvertently they connect with somebody that's out there to financially profiteer off that bad example. And what that can mean is you can have somebody that's worked at a facility that has lots of rich information that's very valuable for the reconnaissance phase of an attack, and that information can be provided to a threat actor. And when you pair those two things together, those threat actors can create and craft very accurate packages or exploits that can compromise critical entities. Now, if we look at some of the cost of operational downtime, the Perfmon Institute stated that it was about $125,000 per hour. We also saw ABB do a study. They went out and did a survey to a number of manufacturing organizations that said it normally is actually up to $349,000 an hour. So what we see is not only are threat actors leveraging ransomware within the manufacturing sector as a top priority, they're also looking at how they can add additional layers of criticality behind decision making. So rather than an organization having the luxury to take time and respond, the threat actor is applying pressure in the form of extortion to expedite payment. And when that threat actor receives payment, in many instances, they'll actually share the reward with the person that's disgruntled and shared intellectual property, right? Or internal information that's highly valuable. Now, when we look at kind of the MITRE ATT&CK framework or the way that these threat actors obtain this access, a lot of the time it is through rich reconnaissance, and that disgruntled employee can talk about maybe the operating system or the terminals that they were frequently using, the email clients, maybe some default username and credentials that were publicly available, or worst case, internally shared. Then what happens is, in many instances, they will look at who they can target within that organization, who's maybe a softer target that may not have completed cybersecurity awareness training or any advanced maybe phishing attack simulation activities. A common mechanism or a dropper is something like a remote access Trojan, like a rat. One that's frequently still used is known as Dark Comet. And that is a way where an end user can open an email. It inadvertently allows them to install an executable with the appropriate binaries to open a remote session. Now, the reason why this is quite dangerous is because if you go and install a remote access tool, it's not necessarily going to be flagged as a malicious application. It can be used for malicious purposes. So what we've observed is, again, a preliminary mechanism to get in is target somebody that is maybe not well versed or well educated in the cyber domain, target on a system that may be legacy or potentially vulnerable to exploitation, leverage some form of remote access Trojan or remote access tool like Dark Comet to ultimately collect data, package it, and then exploit a firm. Or alternatively, they can deploy a variant of ransomware that locks up critical assets within the business and prevents them from performing functions that generate revenue as well. I think an important thing to consider here is within the IT domain, when we observe that systems are compromised, we can fall back on the simplicity of simply reformatting someone's system and bringing it back up online. What we're seeing now, especially within the manufacturing sector, when organizations are compromised, they actually have to sit in that uncompromised state with the inability to actually do anything. A lot of the time we see organizations that have been compromised, the key revenue generation of the business is still running, and they can't afford to shut things down, right? Because it might take 2 or 3 weeks or months to bring things back up online. So we're conscious that in many cases, IT supports the business and OT actually is the business. And the way in which we respond to compromise also shifts and changes as well. Hopefully that provides a little bit of context as to some of the things we're seeing. As I mentioned, ransomware is kind of the key target for ransomware at the moment is within the manufacturing landscape. The other thing that I wanted to touch on is we release a threat intelligence audit and report annually. And what we've observed is there are more than 36,000 malicious scans per second, specifically looking to weaponize automation and map and exploit digital assets within OT networks. And I think what's concerning me is a lot of these assets that reside within these manufacturing facilities, these OT assets that perform critical functions, inadvertently by misconfiguration, or perhaps there was an appropriate security governance wrapped around the implementation project, are publicly available online. And it is very simple for ultimately anyone to leverage free tools that are readily available to look at these assets, discover whether they're using default username and credentials, and again, compromise them and perform malicious activities on either SIP or Modbus TCP.
Thank you, Michael. I think that's a really helpful, example of what you guys are seeing, and helps lead us into the conversation. So I think I might wrap the next. We had a couple of questions that we were sort of going to share, and the panel's going to respond to. So, but I might wrap the sort of next couple together for Muzamil, and it's really how well prepared are sort of you seeing Australian manufacturers, and what's the sort of that unique challenge of the Australian regulatory environment. Oh, you might be on mute.
Thanks, Sam. Sorry, I was on mute. But before we get to that, I think I'll try to segue into broader Australian threat landscape. It's important to understand, I believe, the battlefield before we want to assess our troops. And when it comes to Australian threat landscape, there is an important entity which needs to be considered, called as Australian Signals Directorate, which is ASD, and it sits within the Australian Department of Defence. So it provides all the services regarding cyber to the Australian federal government, be it any signals intelligence, or if Australian government has to run any offensive incident responses, like bringing down any malicious infrastructure, like recently, Lockbit 3.0, Australian government in collaboration with US and UK government bring down the infrastructure of some of the infrastructure of Lockbit 3.0, which has been actively targeting Australia manufacturing and CI critical infrastructure. And apart from that, ASD, through its operational arm called as ACSC, which is, I know a lot of acronyms there, Australian Cybersecurity Centre, has been keenly involved in uplifting the network defenses, as well as collaborating the incident responses within Australia. Like if there's a big breach in public sector or in any other private sector which can have a significance on Australian economy, and like there were some big breaches in 2022, like Medibank breach, or a big telco like Optus got hacked. That's where ACSC came into a rescue and was running the incident response processes for those organizations there. Apart from that, the area where I feel ACSC has done a lot is the critical infrastructure maturity uplift. There were some good programs like CI CHIPS, which stands for Critical Infrastructure Cyber Hygiene Improvement Program, where what they do is they usually run the scans for the external attack surface for the critical infrastructure and manufacturing industries, and if they find any vulnerabilities, they report it to the organization itself, which is not a mandatory report, but it's more of an advisory. It's for me personally, I feel that's very helpful in assessing the efficacy of your controls internally in place. Now, if we assess what ASD is saying, is as per ASD, Australia is currently facing the most complex and contested cyber threat environment since World War II, which isn't just an exaggeration. It's a reflection of the reality we are operating in. We have seen surge in state-sponsored attacks from People's Republic of China, PRC-sponsored actors, and Russia as well. A prime example is PRC-linked Volt Typhoon group, which is known for stealthy activities wherein they try to, position themselves within the network using the native administrative activity so that they are not being detected by the security controls in place. But their actual motive is not to, get data. Main motive is to cause a huge disruption in the future. So they try to, position themselves in IT, and later on they can move to OT side. That's where they can cause a huge disruption. We have also seen, change in tactics from Russian actors, wherein they are trying to actively exploit cloud infrastructure. And some of the hospitals in Australia were impacted, where in their Microsoft Azure virtual desktop environments got hacked. There was MFA, but there's a basic rule in Microsoft. You can have MFA sessions valid for 14 days. That's what was exploited there. And we have seen such an impact there as well. And if you see, now, Sam, to your question, how well prepared are Australian manufacturers? I would say there is good news and still a room for growth as well. On one hand, we'll say programs like CI chips and CI uplift, along with the mandates under the SOC Act, are driving better governance, risk practices, and investment in OT-specific frameworks like IEC 62443. But manufacturers are starting to adopt zero trust, enforce network segmentation, and improve the resilience posture. But let's not sugarcoat it. Still there are challenges like OT visibility, supply risk management, and legacy systems are still there. We have seen, there are vendors, although we all know we need vendors because they present the niche skills which we can't have internally. Yeah, we have seen, but the challenge is most of the times vendors are given VIP passes, so we don't monitor their access on an ongoing basis. And just because a vendor has a big name plate, that doesn't mean they have knocked down the security. SolarWinds is a prime example for that. So we need to make sure we monitor that on an ongoing basis. We know we all have legacy systems in place. There's nothing wrong with it. We know when these systems were made, security was not a big thing, was not a primary concern, and secure by design was not a concept by then, and they are still posing challenges for us at this moment. So to summarize this, I would say Australian manufacturers are heading in the right direction with frameworks and support in place, but in an era where an vulnerable HVAC system or an RDP port can cause national consequences, there is no room for complacency. The future lies in proactive, collaborative, and standards-aligned OT security uplift, because it's not just about keeping the lights on. It's about ensuring those lights can't be switched off remotely by someone sitting in a bunker 10,000 kilometers away in Russia. So we need to make sure, I would say my final word would be, there's a good news that there's a momentum, but the bad news is the adversaries are not waiting. I hope I answered that question.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks, Muzamil. So maybe just following on from that, Michael, your role's wider than sort of just Australia, so you probably see a little bit about how the regulatory environment is maybe perhaps different to our neighbours. Is there anything you wanted to comment on there?
Yeah, so I think there are a number of aspects at play between ANZ, Southeast Asia, India, and North Asia as well. I think when we look at manufacturing, many of us consciously think of that as maybe a facility that performs a simplistic task, which may be creating milk bottles or moving and shifting a critical part of the supply chain. I think a conversation that's frequently neglected is that lo and behold, worst case scenario, some form of physical conflict took place. We also need to look at manufacturing as a way that we preserve our capability to defend ourselves and shift and pivot to maybe go from making milk bottles to some form of military application. I think what we're seeing now is there is an increased level of invested interest from government entities. We look at Australia, we've got the Security of Critical Infrastructure Act 2018 that's recently been uplifted. We've got New Zealand with their voluntary requirements, and we anticipate they will have fully fledged obligations by the end of this year. We've got Singapore with their Critical Infrastructure Act, Malaysia, and we've also got India. So I think what we're observing is there's a heightened level of consciousness for countries that currently are quite self-sufficient, but also need to protect the assets that are fundamental at a point in time where there is potential conflict. Now, when we look at all the legislative reform and the new legislation that's being built, it can be simplified really into four key areas. One is fundamentally understanding what assets you have present within your network, whether it's from an IT or an OT perspective, and being able to filter those assets down to what is actually critical functions of the business. The second is mandatory reporting. So we're seeing that many organizations are now required to meet obligations around cyber compromise. We've seen that recently with regards to ransomware payments. We're also seeing requirements for organizations now to adhere to enhanced cybersecurity obligations. So these are critical business functions that, if they are compromised, it will adversely impact the citizens of that nation. There are predominantly end-user awareness and education activities to do cyber uplift on the people, processes, and technologies within an organization. And then finally, there is some form of annual requirement to report to the government. We have the CIRMP here, the Critical Incident Response Management Program, to highlight to the government the initiatives that organizations have in play to uplift their cyber maturity and explain where they've potentially been threatened, where they've been compromised, and how they're mitigating some of those threats that Muzamil mentioned, like APT-style activity, where threat actors are compromising organizations. They're laying dormant until there's an opportunistic time to cause the maximum level of effect. Now, normally I like to look at this as a bit of a castle mindset, where in medieval times, if you wanted to obtain the castle, rather than flying right in to overtake it, you'd besiege that castle, right? You'd cut off the clean drinking water, you'd cut off the food supply, you'd wait till people got sick and died of dysentery, and then you just walk in and turn everything back on, or alternatively light it with a match rather than flicking the switch. But I think that's kind of a situation that many Australian organizations can align with, because we are remote and we are operating in an area that does not necessarily have immediate close proximity of other countries in many cases. So we need to be mindful of that. And I think when we do look at the legislative changes coming into play, the benefit is the private and the public sector are working together. There's an open dialogue where we're having conversations where IEC 62443, the Purdue model, is highlighted frequently. It doesn't work in every environment, right? It might break critical functions of your business by doing logical segmentation. But the government is listening and they're taking on feedback and they're adjusting accordingly to ensure that, yes, we're looking at network optimization, but we're also looking at maximum cyber resilience as well, and sharing threat intelligence across multiple domains or industry domain verticals that are highly targeted. So maybe I'll pause there rather than going down a convoluted rabbit hole. But I think there's a lot of good stuff that's taking place.
No, that was a really good overview. I might shuffle on if that's okay, because I'm aware that we're sort of end of day and there's only a few minutes left. So hopefully there's some questions coming in. But while they do, there's definitely one more question I wanted over to Muzamil about maturity journeys, because I'm aware that perhaps some of the participants might be sort of starting their cyber journey and looking to work out where, or perhaps early on and looking to work out where to get the best value and how to get things started or early stages. So Muzamil, I think you had some thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. When it comes to OT cyber maturity, most organizations don't start with a master plan. They start with a problem. When their vendor tells them you're running your control system on Windows XP and it is 2025. So, and when it comes to journey, it begins with basic visibility. Just trying to figure out what assets exist within your environment, what is connected to what, and more importantly, what assets shouldn't be exposed to the internet. I think that's very important to understand. From there, it's all about small wins, like network segmentation. You talk about MFA and maybe even convincing leaderships that air-gapped doesn't mean invincible, And when it comes to frameworks in Australia, we usually start with, ask organizations to start with Essential 8, which is a basic, 8 controls which can get you going. You deploy those controls and you can move in the maturity levels as you mature. It works fine in IT side, but in OT side, it is more like an Essential 4.5 with some duct tape. But again, the growth comes with governance, board level awareness, and regular risk assessments, which are key, because you can have legacy systems and you need to make sure you can have a critical vulnerability CVE on that legacy system, but you need to make sure you perform rigorous risk assessments. If that asset is not exposed to internet, and there's absolutely no chance for someone having a remote access to that. For you, it might not pose that risk. So again, the secret in maturity lies that don't try to leap to full maturity. Develop a roadmap and find your champions on on the ground and show progress in business terms. Because if you pitch ICS anomaly detection to your CFO, they will blink. But if you say, okay, this will keep production running and avoid $1 million outages, you will have their attention and maybe even their budget as well. I hope I answered your question, Sam.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, and it's probably just worth also mentioning the collaborative approach that the ASD took recently with other security organisations from nation states across a large part of the Western world, and they produced the principles for OT security. So I'll share a link in the chat shortly. But that's a good starting point to focus on the OT environment as well.
Yes.
So we might just pause there. I know we've got to make time for questions. I know there's other people joining to wrap up the day. So Michael, did you have any parting comments? And then I'll go to Muzamil as well.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. I think to me, one of the key areas that is certainly front of mind and most challenging for organizations is understanding, or when they see their environment, they'll be able to identify an anomaly, but ultimately the ability to quickly decipher with confidence whether they're being exposed to malicious manipulation versus a physical asset that's potentially degraded within the field and ultimately failed just based on the fact that it's old is something that's front of mind to me. We talk to a lot of customers that are attempting to reduce their mean time to detection, mean time to response. But more importantly, I think one of the key takeaways that is really important from this session when you look at your environment is how quickly can you identify an anomaly and how quickly can you identify and differentiate with confidence whether it's one of those two aspects. Because if you can do that, you're well placed to not only meet the government obligations that are in place, but more importantly, identify internally how you can optimize your posture, whether that's through gaining visibility within your network, whether it's segmentation or micro-segmentation to make those assets more difficult to hit, continuously monitoring and controlling access to those assets as well. So again, my key point would be review your environment, look to see how quickly you can identify the difference between malicious manipulation and something that's just failed and degraded over time.
Excellent, thanks, Michael. And Muzamil, just before we wrap up and hand over to questions.
For me, cybersecurity in OT isn't about firewalls and firmware. Sorry, it's about people, partnerships, and preparation, because it's the plant operators who will first notice when something is not right, and it is the engineers who will ask you the hard questions when you try to patch legacy systems, and it's finally the security leaders who bring everyone together, not to lock things down, but to ensure everything is running safely. Thanks.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, thanks, gents. And yeah, given time, I'll hand over to whoever's coordinating questions. Maybe Paul?
Yeah, we did have just one question. This was from Ian, and it's just kind of a general one. Does Australia have its own ISAC?
That's a great question. I think the critical infrastructure ISAC has been gaining a lot of traction recently in Australia. There's a new one that's been funded by the government, which I think is being born out of the CI ISAC as well for the health sector. I'm not aware of one for manufacturing, but others are welcome to jump in.
Okay.